The man didn't knock. He never knocked. Calder Rusk's man rode up to the ranch at dawn, when the ground was still frozen and the air smelled like wood smoke and grief, and he hammered a single nail through a piece of paper into the front door of everything Mara Whitlock had left in this world. He didn't look around, didn't check if anyone was watching, just hit that nail 3 times, bang, 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 like he was hanging a picture in his own parlor, climbed back on his horse, and rode off without ever once looking back at the window where Mara stood watching him go. 72 hours. That's what the notice said. 72 hours to pack every piece of her life into whatever she could carry and walk away from the 640 acres she and her husband had broken their backs on for 11 years. She was 29 years old. She weighed 260 pounds. She had $45, a shepherd dog, and no one coming to help her. If you've ever stood in a doorway and felt the floor disappear beneath your feet, if you know what it's like when the thing holding your whole life together just snaps, then you already know how this story begins. But you don't yet know how it ends. Stay with me, because what Mara Whitlock found at the bottom of that forest is going to change the way you think about who gets to survive in this world and who underestimates whom. And before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like Mara's take everything I have to tell right, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means more than you know. Now, let's go back to that doorway. The nail was still warm from his hammer when Mara pulled the paper off the door. She read it once. Then she read it again, slower, as if the second time might rearrange the words into something that made less sense. It didn't. Continental Frontier Holdings Company. Mineral Rights Clause, Section 14, Subsection C. Failure to vacate within 72 hours will result in lawful removal by county authority. She folded the paper in half. Then she folded it again. She set it on the kitchen table, right next to the coffee mug her husband Daniel had used every morning for the last 8 years. The one with the cracked handle he refused to throw out because he said it still poured fine. She sat down in her chair, not his chair, her chair, and she pressed both palms flat against the table and she breathed. Rook, her shepherd dog, walked over and put his gray muzzle on her knee. "I know," she said. She didn't cry, not yet. There was a strange, hollow clarity that comes when something catastrophic happens, and your brain hasn't quite decided what to do with it yet. She'd felt it once before, 6 months ago, when the doctor came out of the room and didn't have to say a single word because his face already said everything. She'd felt it then. That stillness. That terrible quiet. She felt it now. Daniel had been dead for 6 months, 12 days, and roughly 16 hours. She knew because she still counted. She didn't do it on purpose. It happened the way breathing happened. Automatic, involuntary, the kind of thing your body insists on doing whether you want it to or not. The ranch was supposed to be the thing that outlasted the grief. That was the arrangement she'd made with herself in those first dark weeks after the funeral, when neighbors brought casseroles she didn't eat and said things like, "He's in a better place and you'll find your footing." And she wanted to ask them, very politely, to please leave. The ranch was Daniel's dream before it was theirs, and after he was gone, it became the only concrete thing she could hold on to. She'd learned to mend fences in November. She'd kept the cattle through the winter alone. She hadn't known what she was doing half the time, and she'd done it anyway, because the alternative was sitting in that house feeling the shape of his absence in every room. And now someone had nailed a notice to her door before sunrise. She unfolded the paper and read it a third time. Mineral rights. She turned the phrase over in her mind. Daniel had mentioned mineral rights once, early on, when they were still negotiating the original land purchase. He'd said the language in the deed was complicated, but their lawyer at the time, a man named Foss, who'd since moved away, had assured them it was standard. Daniel had been satisfied. Mara had trusted Daniel's satisfaction. That was the kind of trust you build over 11 years with someone. That trust, it turned out, had a hole in it. She stood up, went to the bedroom, and opened the wooden chest at the foot of the bed where Daniel kept the important papers. She found the deed. She found the original purchase agreement. She spread them across the table and read every line, twice, and found the clause on page 4. A mineral rights reservation that, under specific conditions, allowed the original land company, now absorbed into Continental Frontier Holdings, to reclaim the property in full. The specific condition, apparently, was that they wanted it back. The lawyer in Mill Haven charged $75 just to sit down with him, which told her everything she needed to know before she even opened her mouth. She went anyway, because she had to know for certain. His name was Clement, and he had the kind of face that had practiced looking sorry while delivering bad news so many times that the sorrow had become architectural, built into the slopes of his cheeks, the downturn of his mouth. He read through the deed while she sat across from him in a chair that was slightly too small and slightly too low, and she watched his face, and she knew before he spoke. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, setting the papers down, "the clause is valid. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's legally enforceable under territorial law as currently written." He paused. "A challenge would take months. The filing fees alone would be—" "How much?" He named a number. She had $90. The cattle and horses she'd already sold at a brutal loss. Nobody wanted to buy livestock from a widow who might not be able to guarantee delivery, and the buyers had known that and priced accordingly. $90 total. She'd thought it was a start. Now it was a wall. She thanked Clement and walked out into the street and stood in the cold for a moment, just breathing. A man she recognized, one of the Hayward brothers who ran cattle north of her former property, walked past and stopped when he saw her. He had that look people got around her lately. Part pity, part something else. Something that wasn't unkind exactly, but wasn't kind either. More like assessment. "Heard about the notice," he said. "That's a hard thing." "It is," she agreed. He tilted his head, looked at her the way people looked at a fence post that was starting to lean, sympathetically, but also with the certainty that it was only a matter of time. "You got family you can go to? Somewhere to land?" "I'll figure it out," she said. He nodded, slow and doubtful. "Frontier's rough country for a woman on her own," he said. And then, because he apparently wasn't done, especially— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His eyes moved over her, just briefly, just enough. She smiled at him. The same flat, careful smile she'd been deploying for years whenever someone looked at her large body and assumed it told them something accurate about her capabilities. "Have a good afternoon," she said. She walked back to her horse. She spent 2 days sorting through the ranch. What to keep, what to sell, what to leave behind because there was no practical way to carry grief. Daniel's coffee mug she kept. His survey maps, hand-drawn, meticulous, covering every inch of their property and the surrounding territory. She kept those too, folded into an oilskin pouch, a change of clothes, her good coat, the small iron skillet that had been her mother's, a hunting knife, the oilskin itself. She sold everything else, the remaining furniture, the tools, the spare saddle, 3 bolts of fabric she'd been saving. She spread it out in front of the ranch on the second morning and let people come and pick through it like a yard sale. And she watched them carry away pieces of the life she'd built and kept her face very still and her hands very steady. $90 became $104. On the third morning, the last morning, she walked through every room of the house one final time. She didn't take long. She'd already learned that lingering was a form of punishment you inflicted on yourself, and she had enough pain without adding to it. She closed the door behind her. She didn't look back. Ashford Crossing was 2 days' ride east, a frontier town with a single main street and the particular atmosphere of a place that had been promised a future that hadn't quite arrived yet. It had a general store, a telegraph office, a boarding house, 2 saloons, and a small, smoke-stained office above the hardware store where a man named Greer sold property deeds for cash. Mara tied her horse outside and climbed the stairs. Greer was a narrow man with the complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, which he clearly did. He had a stack of deed papers on one side of his desk and a half-eaten lunch on the other, and he looked up at Mara with the automatic scan that strangers gave her, the quick up and down that most people didn't realize they were doing. And then he straightened slightly, and she could tell he was recalibrating, trying to figure out what category of customer she represented. "Looking for property," she said before he could ask. "Something cheap, something that's been sitting." "How cheap?" "Whatever $50 buys me." He raised both eyebrows. "Not much at that price. Not with a structure on it." "Show me what you have." He showed her 3 options. A 1/4-acre lot at the edge of town with no building, a burned-out storage shed 12 miles north, and a photograph, or rather, a rough sketch, of a cabin 20 miles into Iron Pine Forest, described in the deed as a single-room dwelling, partial stone foundation, condition poor. How poor? She asked. Greer shrugged. Seller's been trying to move it for a year. Roof's reportedly compromised. Nobody goes into Iron Pine that far, so there's no local knowledge of current condition. He paused. $45. The man who owns the deed just wants it off his books. Mara looked at the sketch for a long moment. 20 miles into a forest. Broken roof. No neighbors. No town. No one to help her if something went wrong. Also, no one to watch her fail. I'll take it, she said. She counted out $45 on Greer's desk and signed the deed with her name, and she did it without hesitation, because hesitation was a luxury that required options, and she was fresh out. She rode to the general store and spent what little she had left on flour, salt, dried beans, 2 boxes of matches, a tin of lamp oil, and 1 box of ammunition for the Winchester rifle she'd hung onto when she sold everything else. The woman behind this counter at the general store was older, gray-haired, with the look of someone who had seen enough of the world that very little surprised her anymore. She watched Mara load her provisions into her saddlebags without offering assistance, which Mara appreciated. You headed into Iron Pine? The woman asked. She must have heard Mara's conversation with Greer. I am. The woman was quiet for a moment, then, road gets rough past the 12-mile mark. After that it's more of a trail, goes north-northeast through a draw, and then up toward a ridge. Cabin's on the backside of that ridge, in a hollow. Mara looked at her. You know it? My husband freighted supplies to Old Vane twice, years back, before he stopped wanting visitors. She paused. Silas Vane, the man who built it, died about 4 years ago, or everyone assumes he did. Just disappeared one winter. Nobody looked too hard. She slid Mara's supplies across the counter. He was peculiar, kept to himself. Some people said he'd gone soft in the head. A pause. But I always thought he seemed like a man who knew something he didn't want to know. She didn't explain further. Mara didn't ask her to. Well, the ride into Iron Pine took most of a day. The forest was old, the kind of old that felt less like nature and more like a presence. The pines grew dense enough that even with the leaves mostly down, the light came through filtered and gray, and the sound of Ashford Crossing faded away within the first hour until there was nothing but wind and the creak of her horse's saddle and Rook's paws in the dead leaves ahead of her. Mara didn't find this silence frightening. She found it honest. People were exhausting in a way she hadn't fully recognized until the past 6 months, when everyone around her had an opinion about what she should do, how she should look while she was doing it, and what her chances were of doing it successfully. The forest didn't have opinions. It just was. The trail got rougher at the 12-mile mark, exactly as the woman had said. By the time she reached the ridge, her horse was tired and so was she, and the light was going gold at the edges, which meant she had maybe 2 hours before dark. She found the cabin in the hollow. It was worse than the sketch. The roof on the east side had partially collapsed, not all the way down, but bowed and broken, with daylight showing through in 2 places. One window shutter had fallen off entirely. The stone foundation on the north wall was intact, but the wooden skirting that should have connected it to the cabin walls was rotted through in several spots. There was a porch of sorts, 3 steps, and a narrow platform, but one of the steps was gone and the platform listed badly to the left. Mara sat on her horse and looked at it for a long moment. Behind her, the forest ran back into darkness. Ahead of her, the cabin sagged and waited. She climbed down. Her legs ached from the ride. Her back ached. She was hungry and tired, and the temperature was dropping fast, and she was standing in front of a $45 cabin in the middle of nowhere with a broken roof and $45 of everything she had left in the world spent on it. She tied her horse to the porch post that still looked solid, pulled her saddlebags down, and climbed the 2 remaining steps. The door was unlocked, or rather, the lock was broken, and it swung inward when she pushed. Inside it smelled like old wood and damp earth, and something underneath both of those things that she couldn't quite name. Dust. Abandoned time. The remains of Silas Vane's furniture were still there. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow shelf along one wall, a stone fireplace that looked structurally sound even if everything around it wasn't. There were books still on the shelf, papers, a lantern without oil, 2 tin mugs. Rook walked in past her legs, nose down, tail moving in slow arcs. Not the cheerful wagging he did when he was happy, but the careful, deliberate sweep he did when he was working. Investigating. He walked the perimeter of the room, sniffing along the baseboards, and then he stopped in front of the fireplace. He stood there and he scratched at the floor. "Not now," Mara said. She set her bags down and went back outside to bring in wood. She had a fire going within 30 minutes, and to her genuine relief, the chimney drew well, no smoke backing up into the room. The warmth spread slowly, uncertainly, but it spread. She made a small meal from her provisions, just enough to stop the hollow ache in her chest, and she sat by the fire with her rifle across her knees, and Rook pressed against her leg, and she thought, with a clarity that sometimes only comes at the bottom of things, about what had actually happened to her. She was not a fool. She had never been a fool, even when people treated her like one. Continental Frontier Holdings had not evicted her because of a mineral rights clause. Or, they had, technically. The clause was real. But clauses like that existed in dozens of property deeds across the territory, and they didn't invoke them all. They invoked them when they wanted something. She'd been thinking about what they wanted from her land. Since that first morning she'd read the notice, turning it over, and she couldn't make it add up to anything simple. Their ranch was good land, solid grazing, reliable water from the creek. But so were 50 other properties in the county. There was something specific about her 640 acres that she didn't know yet. She filed that thought away. Rook scratched at the floor again. She looked at him. "You're not going to stop, are you?" He scratched again. She took the lantern she'd filled with her tin of lamp oil and held it down toward where he was pawing at the stone floor in front of the fireplace. There were flagstones there, old, gray, thick, and the mortar between them was cracked and dark with age. Rook's nose was pressed right into the seam along the south edge of the center stone. He was practically vibrating with attention. Mara set the lantern on the hearthstone and crouched down. She ran her fingers along the crack he'd been obsessing over. It was wider than the others, and the stone itself, now that she looked, sat slightly higher on the south edge, as if something beneath it was pushing up, or as if it had been lifted and replaced more than once. She stood up, got the fire poker from beside the hearth, pried it into the crack. The stone moved. It moved easier than it should have for a stone that size, shifted sideways with a grinding protest, and revealed the edge of something dark beneath. She got her fingers under the lip and lifted, and the stone came up in two pieces. It had been split at some point and fitted back together, and underneath was dark earth. No, not earth. Iron. A flat iron plate, maybe 18 inches across, set flush with the ground beneath the removed stone, and on the near edge of that plate, barely visible in the lantern light, a lever handle, black iron, crusted with old grease, folded down flat. Mara stared at it. Rook sat down beside her and looked up at her face with an expression that very clearly communicated, "I told you." She reached down, gripped the lever handle, and lifted it to the upright position. It resisted, then gave. And somewhere below and behind her she heard a sound. A deep mechanical chunk from somewhere beneath the floor, like a tumbler releasing. She stood up slowly, stepped back, looked at the floor of the cabin. In the corner near the north wall, the spot she'd been meaning to stack firewood, a seam she had dismissed as a crack in the boards was, in the lantern light, a perfect rectangle. A trapdoor. She walked to it, pulled the iron ring recessed into the wood. It opened. Cold air rose from below. Not the cold of outdoor night, but something older and more settled. Underground cold. The kind that belongs to places that haven't seen air in a very long time. She lifted the lantern, leaned into the opening. Below her, stone steps descended into the dark. Rook pressed close to her leg. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Mara Whitlock, the plus-size frontier widow everyone had decided didn't have a chance, tightened her grip on the lantern handle, pressed her boot onto the first stone step, and began to go down. The steps were uneven. Mara learned that on the third one, when her boot caught the edge and she had to grab the earthen wall with her free hand to keep from pitching forward into the dark. The lantern swung and threw wild shadows against the stone, and for a moment the whole staircase seemed to tilt sideways, and she stood very still with her palm pressed against cold, packed earth until the light settled and her heart settled with it. Rook was behind her. She could hear him, that small, uncertain sound he made, halfway between a whine and a breath, when he was deciding whether something was safe. She'd learned to trust that sound as much as any fence or lock. He made it once, then went quiet, and she felt him take the first step after her. She went the rest of the way down carefully, testing each stone before she put her weight on it. There were 11 steps. At the bottom, the floor was packed dirt, hard and cold as iron, and the ceiling was low enough that she had to angle her head slightly forward. The space opened up beyond the staircase into a room that was larger than she expected, maybe 15 feet across and 10 feet deep, the walls lined with old brick that had been laid with some care, the mortar between them still mostly sound, even after what must have been years of abandonment. There was a smell down here she hadn't been able to name from above. Now she could. It was the smell of paper, old paper, and lamp oil, and the particular dry mustiness of a sealed room that had been holding its breath for a very long time. She held up the lantern and turned slowly. Along the left wall, 3 wooden crates sat stacked against each other, their wood swollen and darkened with age but still intact. A narrow shelf ran along the back wall at shoulder height, and on it sat 2 lanterns, both with oil in them, she discovered when she lifted the first one and sloshed it, and a row of books that had been laid on their sides to keep them from warping. A heavy canvas tarpaulin covered something against the right wall, and in the center of the room, bolted to a wooden frame that had been set directly into the dirt floor, sat the vault. It was iron, old iron, black with age, roughly the size of a steamer trunk. The hinges on the front were thick and purposeful, and the lock mechanism looked like the kind that required more than a standard key. There was a combination dial on one side and a keyhole on the other, and both of them would take work. Mara stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she pulled the canvas tarpaulin off the object against the right wall. Beneath it was a desk. A proper writing desk, small but solid, with 2 drawers on the right side and a flat surface that still held the ghost of use, faint ink stains in the grain of the wood. On the desk sat a single object, a ledger bound in dark brown leather, water-stained at the bottom corner, but otherwise intact. A leather strap held it shut, and the strap had a small brass buckle that had gone green with age. She set the lantern down on the desk, sat on the edge of the crate nearest her, and opened the ledger. The handwriting inside was small and cramped and leaned hard to the left, like the man who wrote it was trying to keep his words out of sight even on the page. The ink was faded but legible, and the first entry was dated 11 years back, not long after she and Daniel had bought their own land, which struck her as an odd coincidence, and then struck her harder as something that might not be a coincidence at all. The name on the inside cover was written in a different hand, larger, more deliberate, as if someone had added it after the fact as a label. It read simply, S. Vane, Personal. She lit the second lantern from the flame of her own, and she began to read. Silas Vane had not been a recluse by nature. That much was clear within the first dozen pages. He wrote the way people wrote when they were used to writing, not straining for words, not stumbling over how to put things, just laying them down in order. He'd been educated somewhere, though he never said where. He'd worked for Continental Frontier Holdings for at least 7 years before he bought the cabin, and his early entries were the entries of a man who believed in what he was doing. Survey work, boundary mapping, property assessment for potential acquisition. He described his work with the pride of someone who thought precision was its own kind of virtue. Mara read those early pages fast. She slowed down when the tone changed. The shift happened around the 4th year of entries. It started with a single line, sandwiched between a mundane record of survey measurements and a note about the weather. I have been asked to adjust the eastern line of the Holt property by 40 rods. I have been told this is a clerical correction. I know that it is not. She stopped. Read it again. 40 rods was 220 yards. In survey terms, that was not a clerical error. That was a deliberate relocation of a property boundary, the kind of change that could transfer timber rights, water access, or mineral claims from one owner to another without the original owner ever knowing it had been done. The next entry was a week later. I adjusted the Holt line as directed. Foss signed off on the corrected survey. I did not sleep well. Foss. She knew that name. Foss had been the lawyer who reviewed her and Daniel's deed before they purchased the ranch. The lawyer who had assured Daniel the mineral rights clause was standard. Her hands were not quite steady as she turned the page. The entries that followed were not comfortable reading. Vane documented everything, and she understood now that the documentation had not been innocent record-keeping. He was building something, a case, an archive, a collection of evidence that he'd clearly never intended to use and also clearly could never bring himself to destroy. He wrote about boundary adjustments, plural. He named properties, and he named surveyors, and he named the Continental Frontier employees who gave the orders. He noted which local officials had received payments and what form those payments took, sometimes cash, sometimes land grants. Once a new horse that appeared in a county clerk's stable the same week a disputed deed was finalized. He named the sheriff 3 times, not as a witness, as a participant. And woven through all of it, growing denser as the years went on, was the name Calder Rusk. Not always directly, sometimes just as the president or the office or above. But the orders traced back, and Vane had been careful enough, or frightened enough, to note the chain every time. Mara had grown up on a working ranch. She'd butchered cattle, mended wire, pulled breech calves in the middle of the night in the mud. She was not a woman who went pale at unpleasant realities. But her stomach did something strange and cold as she read, because she was beginning to understand the shape of what she was looking at, and the shape was much larger than one evicted widow. She turned to the last section of the ledger. The entries here were shorter, more compressed, the handwriting tighter, the dates closer together, the last year of Vane's time in the cabin, from the looks of it. And here, the tone shifted a second time. I have found what I was not supposed to find. The Whitlock property sits above a silver formation. I have the preliminary assay report. I have hidden it with the rest. I cannot decide if I am a coward for hiding here or a coward for not doing more. Perhaps both. The Whitlock property. Her property. Hers and Daniel's. She read the line a second time, and then a third, and the cold feeling in her stomach spread up into her chest and sat there. Silver. She thought about Daniel, who had pulled her close on a cold night their 3rd winter on the ranch, and said, "I think we picked the right piece of dirt, Mara. I really do." He'd meant it the way people meant things like that. The grass, the water, the sense of a place being theirs. He had not known. She was certain now, reading this, that he had not known. She turned to the last entry in the ledger. It was dated 4 years ago, which matched what the woman at the general store had said about Vane's disappearance. They know I have it. I don't know how, but they know. I will not run because there is nowhere to run that they cannot find me. But I will not make it easy. Whatever happens to me, let this remain. Let someone find it who can use it. I am tired of knowing things I was not brave enough to act on. If you are reading this, whoever you are, I am sorry I could not do more with what I had. Do more than I did. Mara closed the ledger. She sat in the underground room with 2 lanterns burning and Rook pressed against her legs, and she was very, very quiet for a long time. She did not open the vault that night. Not because she didn't want to. The want was a physical thing, pressing at her ribs. But because the vault had a combination lock and a keyhole, and she had neither the combination nor the key, and she was tired down to the marrow, and she needed to think. She needed to think about what she'd just read. And thinking was harder when she was running on exhaustion and adrenaline and a dinner that had barely been enough. She went back up the steps, pulled the trapdoor shut behind her, and replaced the loose flagstone as best she could, fitting the 2 pieces back together. She banked the fire, spread her bedroll near the hearth, and lay down with Rook warm against her back, and the rifle in reach and the ledger tucked under her head, because she couldn't think of a safer place for it. She meant to think through what she'd read. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately, which was the body's way of overriding the mind when the mind was about to become its own worst enemy. She woke to gray light coming through the broken shutter, and Rook standing over her, ears forward, staring at the door. She was upright and had the rifle in her hands before she was fully conscious. Old instinct, the kind that gets built by years of living somewhere that coyotes came for calves in the night, and you learn to go from asleep to armed without the in-between. She listened. Wind in the pines, her horse shifting weight outside, the creak of the damaged roof settling in the cold morning air. Nothing else. Rook's ears relaxed, slowly, and then he looked at her with that expression that meant he'd been wrong or she'd been right, and either way, no threat, and she let the rifle drop to her knees and sat on the bedroll for a minute, breathing. "You're going to give me a heart condition," she told him. He went to the door and looked back. "Yes, fine," she said. "I'm getting up." "What?" In the morning light, the cabin looked worse and also more workable, which was a paradox she didn't try to resolve. The broken roof section on the east side was a problem. Water damage would come with the next rain. But the fireplace wall was solid, the floor was mostly sound, and the structure itself wasn't going anywhere. It was the kind of building that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing, even if the years had been rough on it. She could see it in the foundation work, in the way the stone chimney had been mortared, in the placement of the cabin itself, set back into the hollow, which meant the hill behind it would block the worst of the winter wind from the northwest. Whoever built it had thought about where they were putting it. She thought about Silas Vane, cramped handwriting and all, and wondered if he'd felt something like what she felt right now, standing in a place that was barely shelter, reading it for what it might become. She spent the morning on practical things, because practical things were how she knew to move through difficulty. She repaired the broken shutter with materials she found in one of the 3 crates in the cellar: hinges, old but usable, and a length of timber that had been stored down there and stayed dry. She swept the worst of the debris from the floor and checked the roof from outside, and found that the broken section could be braced temporarily with one of the longer porch boards, which she cut to length with the small handsaw she'd carried with her. It wasn't a fix, it was a stopgap. But stopgaps were what she had. She worked until her hands ached and her back told her it was done being reasonable, and then she sat on the porch steps, the ones that were still sound, and ate the last of her dried beans cold from the tin and drank water from the stream she'd found 30 yards behind the cabin, and she thought about the ledger. The ledger was evidence of fraud. Serious, systematic fraud carried out over years by a major corporation with government protection built in. It documented boundary alterations, bribery, and something that Vane had referenced twice in the later entries with a phrasing that she kept turning over: arrangements regarding settlers who refused. He never used a word more specific than arrangements. He didn't need to. Vane was a careful man, and careful men knew how to say things without quite saying them. She thought about what that meant for her specifically. It meant that Continental Frontier Holdings had known about the silver under her property before they invoked the Mineral Rights Clause. It meant that the original deed language, the clause she and Daniel had been told was standard, may have been deliberately inserted to give the company future leverage. It meant that Foss, the lawyer who'd assured Daniel, was on Vane's list of paid associates. It also meant that whoever had employed Silas Vane and then watched him disappear into this forest had very good reason to want whatever he'd left behind, and nobody knew she was here. That last part cut both ways. The combination to the vault she found on the 3rd day. Not because she'd cracked it, she hadn't, and she wasn't that kind of person in the stories anyway. She found it because Silas Vane, for all his paranoia, had been a man who couldn't quite bring himself to trust his own memory, and the combination was written inside the back cover of one of the books on the cellar shelf, in pencil, so faint she almost missed it: 3 left, 17 right, 8 left. No label, just numbers. But it was on the inside back cover of a book called Property Law of the Western Territories, which was either a joke or an accident, and with Vane she was starting to suspect it was neither. She tried it. The vault opened. The first thing she noticed was that there was no money. She'd half expected it. Hidden vault, after all. And when the door swung open and showed her documents instead of currency, she felt a passing wry disappointment that lasted about 3 seconds, because then she started reading what was in front of her. The vault held 4 bound ledgers, each labeled with a year on the spine. They were not personal journals, they were corporate records, the kind that had been kept in a proper office somewhere, and then removed from that office under circumstances that weren't explained but could be inferred. Revenue figures, acquisition costs, survey expenses, names of properties acquired and at what price and through what method. The method column was the part that made her stomach clench, because the methods had their own internal codes, numerical designators that, once she'd seen them used across enough entries, became readable. Code 7 appeared next to properties that had undergone what the ledgers called boundary correction. Code 12 appeared next to properties where the owners had received third-party pressure. Code 3 appeared 4 times, and beside 2 of those 4 entries, the date of the acquisition was followed, in the same handwriting, by the notation, "No further contact." No further contact. From the settler, presumably. 4 times. Her mouth went dry. The last thing in the vault was not a ledger. It was a rolled survey map, hand-drawn, detailed, covering the same territory as Daniel's maps, but with additions that Daniel's maps didn't have. Colored in with faint red pencil along the boundary lines of 3 adjacent properties in the western portion of the territory was a dotted line that curved and dipped in the way that geological formations curved and dipped, and at the center of the dotted line, in small, neat handwriting, silver-bearing quartz formation, confirmed. Estimated depth, 40 to 60 from Tiunt. The dotted line ran directly under the 640 acres that had, until 8 days ago, been Mara Whitlock's ranch. She sat on the dirt floor of the cellar for a long time after that. Not crying, not panicking, just sitting with the weight of it, feeling the full dimensions of the thing. Because it was one thing to suspect you'd been wronged, and another thing entirely to hold the proof of it in your hands and understand that the wrong was much larger and much older than you'd known, and that it had killed people, no further contact, and that the man behind it was still out there, still operating, still sending his men to nail notices to doors before dawn. Rook came and put his head in her lap. She ran her hand over his ears, slow and absent. "Okay," she said, to him, or to herself, or to nobody in particular. "Okay." She spent the next 4 days going through everything, not rushing it. Rushing was how you missed things, and she couldn't afford to miss things. She read every page of every ledger in the vault, and she cross-referenced them against Vane's personal journal, and she cross-referenced those against Daniel's survey maps. And she began to build a picture that was detailed enough to give her both the full shape of the fraud and something more personal. Confirmation that the mineral rights clause in her deed had been inserted after the fact, on orders from someone identified in Vane's ledger only as CR, and that the same 2 initials appeared beside 3 of the 4 no further contact entries. CR, Calder, Rusk. It was not proof in the legal sense. She knew that. She was a frontier widow with a broken-roofed cabin and a shepherd dog, not a lawyer, and she understood the gap between what she could read and what she could prove in a court that had, according to Vane's records, at least 2 compromised officials in its jurisdiction. But it was enough to know. It was enough to understand what she was dealing with and what she would need to do about it. She started making a list. The list was things she needed that she didn't have. A lawyer who hadn't been bought. Someone with the reach to file in federal court rather than territorial court, where the local corruption could reach. A way to transport the evidence without losing it, and without losing herself. Because if Continental Frontier Holdings had even a passing suspicion that Vane's records had survived and that someone had found them, she was exactly as alone and exposed as she'd been on the day she'd sold her cattle for 60 cents on the dollar. She thought about Gideon Price. She'd heard the name twice before today. Once from Daniel, years back, who'd read something in a newspaper about a case Price had taken against a railroad company and said, "That man's either very brave or very stupid, hard to tell which." And once from Clement, the expensive lawyer in Millhaven, who'd mentioned him with the tone that professionals use when they're talking about someone who does the same work as them but differently, something between professional contempt and a reluctant respect. Clement had said, "There's a man named Price in Dunmore who takes cases against corporations. He's mostly lost. He's also a drunk, or used to be, depending on who you believe, but he's the only one in 3 territories who even attempts it." And then Clement had moved on, as if that information were a curiosity rather than a practical suggestion. Dunmore was 6 days' ride, at least, through mountain country with one known pass that was weather-dependent this time of year. She looked at the evidence spread around the cellar, at the 4 bound ledgers, the personal journal, the vault map, the cross-reference notes she'd made in Daniel's handwriting across his survey maps. She could not carry all of it at once, not safely, not alone. She spent a day making copies of the most critical entries, writing in the margins of blank pages she'd found in one of the storage crates, her own handwriting dense and precise. Not everything. There was too much. But the key entries. The boundary alteration orders with names attached. The payment records with dates. The 4 no further contact notations and their corresponding initials. The assay reference and the property designation. She kept the originals where they were, in the vault, locked. The vault went back under the flagstone. She was not naive enough to think that hiding something in the same place where it had already been hidden once was permanent security. But she also understood that nobody knew she was here, and nobody knew the cabin held anything of value, and for the moment, that bought her something. Then the 5th morning came, and she found out how long that moment lasted. She was outside, at the stream, filling her water tin, when Rook's bark came from behind the cabin. Not the deep, chest-heavy bark he used for animals, but the sharp staccato sound he made for strangers. She moved fast and low, back along the tree line rather than across the open ground, and she came around the north side of the cabin in time to see two horses on the trail above the hollow. Two riders. One was scanning the tree line, the other was watching the cabin. They hadn't seen her yet. She was in the shadow of the pines. She studied them. Both men. Both armed. Revolvers visible, and she thought she could see the stock of a rifle on one saddle scabbard. Neither was in uniform. Neither was anyone she recognized. They were doing the kind of looking that people do when they're searching for something specific, not passing through. Her rifle was inside the cabin. The rifle was 50 feet away across open ground. Rook was still behind the cabin somewhere, and she heard him bark again, once, and she willed him to be quiet in the way you will things when you have no power to make them happen. And he went silent, which was either because he'd heard something or because of the particular miracle of a dog who sometimes understood more than he should. One of the riders called out to the other. She couldn't hear the words at this distance, but the second man shook his head and gestured down the trail, back the way they'd come. They talked for a moment, the kind of short, clipped exchange of men who'd been given a job to do and were deciding whether they'd done enough of it. Then the first man looked at the cabin one more time, long and assessing, and she pressed herself harder against the bark of the nearest pine and made herself smaller, which was not a thing she was naturally well suited for, and waited. He looked away. They turned their horses and rode back up the trail. Mara did not move for 3 full minutes after the sound of hooves faded. Then she walked to the cabin, got her rifle, and stood in the doorway watching the tree line until the light started to go. They hadn't found anything. They probably hadn't been sure what they were looking for, but someone had sent them, which meant someone was looking, and that changed every calculation she'd been making about how much time she had. She went inside. She looked at the flagstone over the cellar trap door. She looked at the copies she'd made, folded and tucked inside the oilskin pouch with Daniel's maps. She made a decision. She was not going to wait until she felt ready. She was not going to wait until the roof was fixed or the season was safer or she had more provisions or a better plan. She was going to leave in the morning before dawn, and she was going to take what she could carry, and she was going to put as many miles as possible between herself and whatever those two men had been looking for. Because they'd be back, and next time they might bring someone who asked the right questions at the right places in Ashford Crossing, and someone would remember the heavy woman who'd bought the deed to Silas Vane's old place and ridden east toward Iron Pine. She packed that night. The oilskin pouch with the copies and Daniel's maps. Vane's personal ledger, tucked inside her coat against her ribs where she'd feel it if someone tried to take it. Her provisions, what was left, the rifle, the ammunition, a single change of clothes. She left the other ledgers in the vault. She pulled up the flagstone and looked at the closed vault for a long moment, and she thought, "I'll come back for you," which was the kind of thing you thought when you wanted to believe you'd still have the opportunity. She replaced the stone, smoothed the floor. Then she sat down at the old table and did the one thing she probably shouldn't have taken the time for, but couldn't stop herself from doing. She found a blank page in one of Vane's discarded notebooks, and she wrote a letter. She addressed it to no one, or to whoever might find the cabin after her. She wrote what was in the vault, and where the vault was, and how to open it. She described Vane's ledger and what it contained. She wrote down the name Gideon Price and the town of Dunmore. And at the bottom she wrote one sentence that she didn't examine too closely while she was writing it, because examining it would have required her to admit that she was afraid. And she was afraid. And she was going anyway. "If something happens to me, please make sure Calder Rusk knows he didn't win." She folded the letter and tucked it behind the shelf of books in the cellar, in a spot that someone searching carefully would find, but a quick search would miss. Then she climbed back up, closed the trapdoor, and lay down to sleep for 4 hours. At 4 in the morning, she woke without an alarm and got up in the dark. She saddled her horse by feel, more or less, loaded her bags. Rook materialized from somewhere in the dark and pressed against her knee, and she reached down and gripped the scruff of his neck for a second. Not affectionately, exactly, more like a mutual acknowledgement of the situation. 6 days, she said. Maybe 7 if the pass is bad. She mounted. The forest was black around her, and the trail up out of the hollow was barely visible, and the night was cold enough that her breath fogged and her horse's breath fogged, and the whole world felt contracted to this small circle of visible things. She pointed her horse toward Dunmore and rode into the dark. Behind her, 20 miles of forest held its breath, and beneath the cabin floor, an iron vault sat locked in the dark with 4 years of evidence inside it, waiting for someone to decide what to do with the truth. The pass was bad. Not impassable. She'd seen impassable once, the winter of her second year on the ranch, when a storm came in from the northwest and buried the high country under 6 feet in 3 days, and Daniel had looked at the drifts and said, very quietly, "We're not going anywhere for a while." This wasn't that. This was the ordinary cruelty of a mountain pass in late autumn, where the trail was narrow and the footing was uncertain and the wind had a personal quality to it, like it was specifically interested in finding the gaps in her coat. She crossed on the 5th day, later than she'd planned, because her horse had thrown a shoe 2 days out from the cabin, and she'd spent the better part of an afternoon walking him carefully over loose shale while her back complained and Rook ranged ahead like he was scouting, which maybe he was. She'd found a settlement, barely a settlement really, 4 buildings and a sign that said Carver's Rest, where a taciturn man with a forge had reshod her horse for $3 and not asked a single question about where she was going or why she was alone or what was in her saddlebags. She'd been grateful for that last part in a way she couldn't have fully explained. The nights on the trail had been cold and largely sleepless, not because she couldn't find shelter, but because her mind refused to cooperate. She'd lie in her bedroll with Rook pressed against her and the rifle beside her, and she'd stare at the underside of whatever rock overhang or stand of pines she'd chosen, and her brain would pull out the ledger entries and turn them over and over like a man checking coins for counterfeits. Code 3. No further contact. 4 times. 4 properties. 4 families who had something Continental Frontier Holdings wanted, and who had then ceased, from the company's perspective, to exist. She thought about those families on the long, cold hours before dawn, and she thought about Daniel, and she made herself stop thinking about Daniel because that was a door she couldn't afford to walk through right now, not on a mountainside in the dark with 6 days still to ride. She got to Dunmore on the 7th morning, which was 2 days later than she'd hoped, and exactly on schedule given the shoe problem and the pass, and she rode down the main street with the oilskin pouch across her lap and her coat covering the ledger tucked against her ribs. And she looked like what she was, a woman who'd been riding hard in cold weather for a week, and nobody paid her particular attention, which was fine. Dunmore was larger than Ashford Crossing. It had a proper courthouse, 2 hotels, a doctor's office, and enough foot traffic on the main street to feel like a place with a future. She found the telegraph office first because she wanted to know if there were any messages, which was irrational. She had no one to receive messages from, but she checked anyway. Some persistent hope that the world had sent something. It hadn't. She found a livery for her horse, a water trough for Rook, and a woman at the boarding house on the south end of town who rented her a room for 50 cents a night and didn't comment on the fact that Mara had a large shepherd dog and a rifle and the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "Bath is in the back room," the woman said. "Water costs extra." "How much extra?" 15 cents. "I'll take it." She paid for 2 nights because she didn't know how long this would take, and she didn't want to be explaining her situation to the woman at the desk again in 48 hours. Then she went upstairs, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and spent 10 minutes doing nothing but breathing, which was the closest thing to rest she'd had since she left the cabin. Then she got up, washed her face in the basin, put on her better shirt, and went to find Gideon Price. I was not hard to find. The woman at the boarding house gave her directions without being asked, which suggested that Price was well known enough in Dunmore that strangers looking for him was a normal occurrence. His office was above a saddlery on the east end of town. 2nd floor, door at the top of an exterior staircase. A painted sign that read G. Price, Adjoint at Law, in letters that had once been black and were now a faded charcoal gray. She climbed the stairs, knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. From inside, the sound of something being moved, a chair scraping, paper shifting, and then a voice that was deeper than she'd expected and carried the particular flatness of a man who had been interrupted while doing something he'd rather not have interrupted. "Office hours are posted on the door." She looked at the door. There was nothing posted on it. "There's nothing on the door," she said. A pause. Then, 10 to noon. "It's 10:30. Another pause, longer this time. Then footsteps. and the door opened. Gideon Price was somewhere in his late 40s, she guessed, though the years had arranged themselves on him in the way that made precise estimation difficult. The lines in his face were deep, but his eyes were sharp, and the gray in his hair was patchy rather than uniform, as if it had come in during specific periods of stress and stopped when the stress did. He was thin in the way of men who forgot to eat regularly rather than men who watched what they ate. His shirt was clean but not pressed. He had ink on his right hand and what looked like the remains of this morning's breakfast on his left cuff, and he was holding a coffee cup that was clearly providing more structural support to his morning than the coffee itself. He looked at her the way people looked at her. The assessment, the recalibration. But his was faster than most and landed somewhere more neutral than most, and he didn't make her feel it the way some people did. "Mrs. he started. "Whitlock. Mara Whitlock." She paused. "I need a lawyer who takes cases against corporations and doesn't lose his nerve when the corporation pushes back. I was told you were the best option in 3 territories, though the man who told me said it without much enthusiasm." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Come in, Mrs. Whitlock." His office was what she'd expected, and also not quite what she'd expected. The expected part? Books. More books than she'd seen in any private space outside of a library, stacked on shelves and on the floor and on the edges of the desk, and in what appeared to be an organizational system that made sense only to the person who'd built it. Legal texts, survey references, maps pinned to the wall, a filing cabinet with the top drawer that wouldn't quite close. The not expected part, a corkboard along the right wall that was covered in newspaper clippings and handwritten notes connected by lengths of string, red string, mostly, occasionally switched out for what looked like ordinary kitchen twine when he'd run out of the red. It was the board of a man who was either investigating something very complicated or had lost control of a filing system, and with Price, she suspected both were simultaneously true. He cleared papers from the second chair and gestured for her to sit, and she did, and she noticed that he glanced at her rifle. She'd brought it, slung over her back, with a mild, accepting look and said nothing about it. He sat down across from her with his coffee cup. "Continental Frontier Holdings," he said. She blinked. "I haven't told you anything yet." "No," he agreed. "But you said you needed someone who doesn't lose his nerve when a corporation pushes back, and in this territory that narrows the field considerably. Continental Frontier is the corporation that pushes back." He tilted his head. "How did they come after you?" "Mineral rights clause. They evicted me from a 640-acre ranch my husband and I built over 11 years. My husband has been dead 6 months." She kept her voice even. She'd practiced keeping it even. The clause was legitimate on its face, but I have reason to believe the original deed language was altered to include it after the fact, and that the lawyer who reviewed the deed was a paid associate company. Price was quiet for a moment. "Reason to believe or evidence?" She reached inside her coat and pulled out Vane's personal ledger and set it on the desk between them. He looked at it, didn't touch it yet. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "A man named Silas Vane. He worked for Continental Frontier as a surveyor. He documented the fraud over a period of years and then disappeared 4 years ago." She paused. "The ledger was in a sealed cellar beneath a cabin I purchased in Iron Pine Forest." Now he looked up at her. "A sealed cellar. Behind a hidden trapdoor. There was also a vault." He was quiet for a moment longer. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, which she found she respected. Most people's thinking was visible on their faces, whether they meant it to be or not. "What was in the vault?" he asked. 4 years of Continental Frontier's corporate ledgers, revenue records, acquisition costs, payment records for local officials including the county sheriff, and a lawyer named Foss. And a survey map with a geological notation indicating a silver-bearing quartz formation directly beneath the property I was evicted from. Price set his coffee cup down. He picked up the ledger and opened it. He read in silence for several minutes while Mara sat across from him and watched him read, and she watched his face change. Not dramatically, not the way faces changed in theatrical stories, but the small, incremental way that the face of an intelligent person changed when they were absorbing something that was reorganizing their understanding of a situation. The slight tightening around his eyes, the fraction of movement in his jaw. He turned to the last section. She watched him find the no further contact entries. His jaw did something then that she couldn't quite name, not quite a clench, more like a bracing. He set the ledger down. The originals are still at the cabin, she said, locked in the vault. I made copies of the key entries and brought the personal journal. 2 men came to the cabin while I was there. I left before they returned. They'll have identified you by now, he said. Someone in Ashford Crossing will have mentioned the property purchase. I know. And they'll know you went somewhere with whatever you found. He leaned back in his chair. It creaked under him in a way that suggested it had been leaning back with him for many years. Mrs. Whitlock, do you understand what Continental Frontier Holdings is? A corporation that commits fraud and makes settlers disappear. A corporation that controls, he said slowly, approximately 1/3 of the commercial land transactions in this territory, has financial relationships with 4 county officials that I have been able to document. 4. And has managed to defeat or suppress every legal challenge brought against it in the past decade, including 2 that I brought myself. He paused. I lost both of those cases. One was dismissed on a procedural technicality that I still believe was manufactured. The other went to a judge who retired to a very comfortable situation in the Southwest 6 months after the ruling. I understand, she said. I'm not sure you do. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying it because people come to me with evidence against powerful companies, and they believe that evidence is sufficient, and sometimes it is, and sometimes the evidence disappears, and the people disappear with it, and I have lost more sleep over the second category than I care to admit. He looked at her steadily. I need you to know what you're considering before you walk further into this. Mara looked back at him with the same steadiness. Mr. Price, she said, I have $40, a shepherd dog, a broken-roofed cabin in Iron Pine Forest, and the evidence to prove that Calder Rusk has been stealing land and silencing people for at least a decade. I have been on this road for a week in cold weather with a horse that threw a shoe, and I have slept, on average, about 4 hours a night because my brain will not stop processing what I read in that cellar. She paused. I am not under any illusions about what I'm walking into. I am asking you whether you are willing to walk into it with me. A long silence. Then Price picked up the ledger again, turned to the first page, and set it flat on the desk between them. Show me the entries you cross-referenced against your husband's survey maps, he said. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and by 3 o'clock Mara had spread Daniel's maps across Price's desk and floor, and they'd been at it long enough that the coffee had been replaced with water, and then with more coffee, and Price had at some point shed his jacket without appearing to notice he'd done it. He had a mind that moved fast and laterally, connecting things she hadn't connected, asking questions that opened angles she hadn't considered. He wanted to know the exact language of the mineral rights clause. He wanted to know the date the deed had been recorded against the dates in Vane's ledger when the boundary alteration orders had been issued. He was interested, very interested, in the entry where Vane had named Foss because Foss, it turned out, had not merely moved away from the territory. Foss had joined the legal department of Continental Frontier Holdings 3 years ago. That's not in the ledger, Price said, when she asked how he knew. How do you know it then? He gestured at the corkboard. I have been building that for 2 years, he said. I didn't have the center of it. I had the edges. He looked at the ledger, then at her. You brought me the center. She absorbed that. The corporate ledger's in the vault, he said. Can you get back to them? If the cabin hasn't been searched, and if the men who came by were just doing a sweep and not a detailed search. We need those originals. Copies will support testimony, but originals carry weight that copies don't. He drummed his fingers on the desk. Going back into Iron Pine is a risk. They may have someone watching the trail now. They may, she agreed, but they don't know what's in the vault. If they did, they would have broken into the cabin already, and the vault would be gone. They're looking for Vane's records, but they're not certain the records are there. That uncertainty won't last long. No, she said. It won't. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him running calculations, the kind that weren't about numbers but about risk and weight and what could be sacrificed and what couldn't. She recognized the look because she'd been wearing it herself for the past week. There's something else, she said. She reached into the oilskin pouch and pulled out the last thing she'd taken from the cellar, the thing she'd almost left behind and then, at the last moment, had tucked into her coat pocket without knowing exactly why. A silver locket on a thin chain, tarnished almost black, that she'd found in a small cloth bag at the bottom of the vault beneath the last ledger. She set it on the desk. Price looked at it without touching it. There was a name in Vane's personal entries, she said. He mentioned it only twice, Eliza Mercer. He wrote that she was from the Mercer homestead in the northeast section, one of the 4 no further contact entries. He wrote that he'd kept this because he couldn't bear that she'd just... Mara stopped for a moment. She'd read this passage 4 times in the cellar, and it had gotten harder each time, not easier. He wrote that she'd just vanished as if she'd never been, and he wanted there to be something that said she had been, that someone had known her name. Price's hand moved toward the locket and stopped. Her property was listed as acquired in the second corporate ledger, Mara said. The acquisition method was Code 3, and the date of acquisition was 11 years ago. He was very still. Rusk was running this for at least 11 years, she said. Yes, Price said. His voice was flat and careful. He was. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Price picked up the locket, opened it. Inside were 2 tiny painted portraits, the kind that daguerreotype artists made for people who couldn't afford proper photographs. A woman on one side, young, dark-haired, with the slight stiffness that portrait subjects always had, and on the other side a child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, the same dark hair. He closed it carefully and set it back down. I'll take your case, he said. What? The next 2 days were not simple. Nothing in Price's world appeared to be simple, but she discovered quickly that what looked like disorganization in his office was actually a specific kind of density. The accumulation of 2 years of careful, unfunded, largely unassisted work on the margins of an investigation he'd never quite had enough evidence to push into the center. The corkboard was not a mess. It was a map. And once she understood it as a map, she could see where the gaps were, and she could see, with a prickling, vertiginous clarity, that what she'd brought him filled most of them. He had other clients. He went and dealt with them in the mornings, returning to the office by noon with the look of a man who'd been solving smaller problems and was eager to get back to the large one. She used the mornings to work through his files on her own. He'd given her access without being asked, which she noted as a form of trust she didn't take lightly, and to update her cross-references, and to write out in clean copy the timeline she'd been building in her head since the cellar. On the second evening, he came back from a meeting with a face that had changed. "Someone's been asking about you in town," he said, without preamble. She looked up from the desk. "A man came through this afternoon asking the livery if a woman matching your description had come through in the last week." He set his hat on the hook by the door. "Heavy set, traveling alone with a shepherd dog. I was told yes, she came in a few days ago, still in town." "What did the liveryman tell him about where I was staying?" "Probably nothing specific, probably enough." He looked at her directly. "We have less time than I'd hoped." She had known this was coming, and she had known it would feel different when it arrived, and it did feel different. A tightening in her chest, something between dread and anger that she'd learned to keep very small and very controlled. "What do you need from me immediately?" "The originals from the vault. Without those physical documents, what we have is strong circumstantially, but a corporate lawyer will call it speculation built on a dead man's private ramblings." He paused. "I need to file for a federal injunction before they move against us directly, and I need the originals to make the filing credible enough that a federal judge doesn't simply dismiss it. We'll go back to the cabin. I know you will. I'll come with you." She looked at him. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "that I'm a middle-aged lawyer who belongs in an office and will slow you down. I was thinking that if something happens to you, there's no one left who knows the full scope of the evidence." He was quiet for a second. "I'll bring duplicates of the critical files. If something happens to me, you have copies. If something happens to you..." He stopped, seemed to consider whether to finish that sentence. "I've been trying to build this case for 2 years, Mrs. Whitlock. If something happens to you before we secure those originals, that case ends. That's not acceptable to me." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back without flinching. "Can you ride for 6 days in cold weather?" she asked. "I've done worse." "Do you have a rifle?" "I have a rifle." "Then be ready before dawn." They left at 4 in the morning, the same hour she'd left the cabin 8 days before, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. She'd ridden out into the dark, carrying everything she'd found, and now she was riding back in the dark to retrieve the rest of it, and the circle of it felt either very purposeful or very dangerous, and probably both. Price rode well enough. He wasn't a natural horseman. She could tell by the slight stiffness in his seat, the way he held the reins a fraction too tight. But he'd been honest about his competence level, which was more than most men would have been. He didn't complain about the cold. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated, because the morning hours before the light came in were the hours she thought best, and she didn't want the thinking interrupted. They made good time the first 2 days, pushing through the lower country before the terrain got difficult. She watched the trail behind them and around them with the automatic attention of someone who'd spent a week doing the same thing, and she saw nothing that alarmed her, which was not the same as seeing nothing to worry about. On the third night, camped in a draw out of the wind with a fire small enough to be invisible from the trail, Price asked her about Daniel. She didn't know why she answered. Maybe because it was dark and she was tired and she'd been carrying it for long enough that it had gotten heavy in a way she hadn't let herself acknowledge. Maybe because Price asked the way people asked when they actually wanted to know, rather than the way people asked when they wanted to demonstrate that they had asked. "He was better at the ranch than me," she said. "That's not false modesty. He had a feel for land, for what it needed, what it could carry, when to push and when to leave it alone. I was better at the books and the contracts and the negotiations." "A good combination," Price said. "It was." She poked the fire with a stick. "He died of something that shouldn't have killed him, an infection, from a wire cut. We didn't get to a doctor fast enough." She paused. "That's the part I have trouble with. Not the grief exactly, or not only the grief. The smallness of it. The way someone who built something real and worked that hard could be taken out by a piece of rusty wire and 2 days' delay." Price was quiet. "I keep thinking," she said, "that if he'd known what was under that land, it might have, I don't know, it might have mattered differently. He deserved to know." She looked at the fire. "Rusk took that from him too. He just doesn't know it." Price said, "He'll know it." The way he said it was not dramatic. It was the way you said something when you meant it as a statement of fact rather than a declaration, and she found it more convincing than anything louder would have been. They reached the hollow on the 5th day, coming in from the north along a different approach than she'd used before. Price had suggested it, and she'd agreed without needing the full explanation, because coming in from the north meant they could see the cabin from the ridge before they descended, and they could check for signs of recent activity. She pulled her horse up at the tree line and studied the hollow below. The cabin looked undisturbed from above. No fresh tracks in the soft earth around the porch that she could see. No horses tied anywhere nearby. The broken shutter she'd repaired was still in place. The porch boards were as she'd left them. "It looks clear," Price said beside her. "It looks clear," she agreed. "That doesn't mean it is." They came down slowly, and she circled the cabin on foot before she went inside, checking the ground, the door, the window latches. The door was exactly as she'd left it. There was no sign that anyone had come inside, though she knew that the kind of men Rusk sent were not necessarily the kind who left obvious signs. Rook ranged ahead of her through the cabin interior and came back satisfied. She went to the fireplace, lifted the flagstone in 2 pieces, reached down and gripped the iron lever and heard the familiar deep chunk from beneath the floor. She went to the trapdoor, pulled the ring. The cellar was exactly as she'd left it, the vault in the center of the room, the books on the shelf. Her letter still tucked behind the second row where she'd left it, which she pulled out and pocketed. She reached for the vault, turned the dial. 3 left, 17 right, 8 left. It opened. The 4 corporate ledgers were where she'd put them. The rolled survey map was where she'd put it. She stood there for a moment with the lantern, just looking at them, feeling something she couldn't entirely name. Not relief exactly, or not only relief. Something more like the weight of what these things represented. 11 years of carefully documented crimes, 4 families, 4 no further contact entries. Eliza Mercer and her child, 2 tiny painted portraits and a tarnished silver locket. She gathered everything, wrapped the ledgers in the canvas tarpaulin she found in the corner, and carried them up the steps in 2 trips. Price was waiting at the trapdoor opening. He took the wrapped bundle on the second trip without being asked, and set it on the table and began examining the ledgers while she replaced the flagstone and lever. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the turning of pages and Rook's occasional movement around the cabin perimeter and the wind in the pines outside. Then Price said, without looking up, "They're thorough." "Thorough enough?" "More than." He turned a page. "The payment records alone are... The level of detail here is remarkable. Vane wasn't just documenting, he was building a case." He looked up. He was building this exact case. He just never had anyone to give it to. She thought of Vane's last ledger entry. "Do more than I did." He found us eventually, she said. Price looked at her for a moment, then he went back to the pages. We'll leave at first light. I want to be back in Dunmore and have these in a secure location before the end of the week. He paused. I'm going to file for a federal injunction the morning after we return. The payment records give me enough to argue judicial conflict of interest at the territorial level, which is why we go federal. If the federal judge grants the injunction, will he? With these? Price ran his hand along the edge of the ledger. Yes, I believe he will. She nodded, went to put a fire on. Her hands were cold from the cellar and she was hungry, and the ride back was going to be as hard as the ride here, but those were practical problems with practical solutions, and she'd gotten very good at those. She was building the fire when Rook's head came up. Not a bark. Just that stillness, ears forward, body orientation shifting to face the door. She was on her feet with the rifle before she'd made the conscious decision to move. Price looked up from the desk. She met his eyes, and he read her face and reached for his own rifle without a word. From outside, hoofbeats. More than 2 horses. Closer than the top of the ridge. They were already in the hollow. She went to the window and looked out through the repaired shutter gap. In the gray late afternoon light, 4 riders were coming down the trail toward the cabin. They were not riding fast. They were riding with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of men who did not expect resistance, which meant they either knew the cabin had been found empty twice before, or they were the kind of men who didn't worry about resistance. 4 of them. 2 rifles in the visible saddle scabbards. She looked at Price. Back door? He asked, very quietly. No back door, she said. Window on the north wall. Drops 4 feet. He looked at the wrapped bundle of ledgers on the table. We can't carry all of it, she said. The words felt like something being cut. The personal journal and the survey map. We leave the corporate ledgers in the vault and we run. His face did something complicated. Then it resolved. The copies you made are in the oilskin pouch on my saddle, which is tied behind the cabin. Then we need to reach the horses before they circle the building. Outside, the hoofbeats were very close. She was already moving. She pulled the vault ledgers off the table, carried them down the cellar stairs in one armful, stumbling on the 3rd uneven step and catching herself against the wall hard enough to bruise her shoulder, and dropped them inside the vault and spun the dial. Back up the steps. Flagstone. Lever reset. Price was at the north wall window, had it open, rifle in his left hand. He looked at her. She grabbed the personal ledger and the survey map, shoved them inside her coat, grabbed the lantern, and extinguished it. The hoofbeats stopped. From outside, a man's voice, flat, businesslike, the voice of someone who had done this before. We know you're in there, Mrs. Whitlock. Come out and there's no trouble. She and Price looked at each other in the dark. She went through the window first because she was the one who knew where the horses were tied, and the drop was exactly 4 feet, and her knees registered their complaint, and she straightened and pressed against the cabin wall and listened. Rook had come through behind her, silent as a shadow. Price's boots hit the ground next to her a second later. The horses were 30 yards along the back wall, in the stand of pines where she'd tied them. 30 yards of open ground between them and the tree line in fading light, with 4 men on the other side of the building. She looked at Price. He nodded. They ran, and somewhere behind her, from the front of the cabin, she heard the door slam open and a voice that was no longer businesslike, that had lost its deliberate calm and replaced it with something much less controlled. They're behind the building. Go, go. Her boots hit the pine needles and she reached her horse and got the reins free in one motion, and she was in the saddle before the first man came around the corner of the cabin, and Price was 2 seconds behind her, and they went into the trees at a gallop, the branches slapping at her face and the cold air burning in her lungs, and somewhere behind her, not close enough, the sound of pursuit beginning. The forest swallowed them. They rode hard and did not stop until the darkness was complete and the sound behind them had faded into nothing, and the only sounds were their own horses breathing and Rook panting somewhere at the edge of the lantern light. Price had managed to relight at a canter, which was either impressive or foolish, and was probably both. She pulled her horse up, checked the oilskin pouch on her saddle, checked her coat for the ledger and the map. Everything she had, still with her. They were alive. For now, that was enough. They rode through the night without stopping. Not because it was safe. Riding through forest in the dark was the opposite of safe. and Mara knew it, and her horse knew it, and twice in the first hour she felt him hesitate at something she couldn't see, and she gave him the rein to pick his own path rather than pushing him through what her eyes couldn't read. But stopping meant the men behind them had time to regroup and flank, and the four riders had been close enough to the cabin when they'd gone through the north window that she wasn't willing to gamble on how good their tracking was in the dark. Price rode without complaining, which she'd half expected him to do. He wasn't a man who complained about physical discomfort, she was learning. He complained about procedural problems and evidentiary gaps and the particular stupidity of territorial court precedent, but cold and saddle soreness and riding blind through pines at a pace that was too fast for comfort. Those he absorbed without comment, as if they were weather. By 2 in the morning, they'd put enough distance between themselves and the cabin that she let herself slow to a walk, and her horse released a long breath that she felt through her whole body. "We need to stop," she said. Not for long. 2 hours. 3, Price said. "I need to write while I still have the shape of what I'm doing in my head." "You can write in the dark?" "I can write in conditions that would make most people question my sanity," he said. "I've been doing it for years." They found a spot, a slight depression in the ground between 2 large pines, sheltered enough from the wind to be tolerable. And she made a small fire while he got out a notebook from his saddlebag and began writing in the firelight, his pen moving with the speed of a man who'd been composing sentences in his head for the past several hours and was finally just transcribing them. She watched him for a moment. Then she checked the oilskin pouch, checked her coat for the ledger and the map. Everything's still there. She'd checked 4 times since the cabin, and she knew she'd check 4 more before morning, and she accepted that about herself without judgment. "What are you writing?" she asked. "The injunction filing," he said without looking up. "The structure of it. While I can see the whole thing." He paused his pen. "When we get back to Dunmore, I have maybe 48 hours before Rusk's people make their next move. The filing needs to be complete and in the hands of the federal court in Harlan before that window closes." "How far is Harlan?" 2 days by fast rider. I have a man I trust who can carry it." He went back to writing. "He's also the only man I trust to send to Iron Pine to retrieve the vault documents while we're occupied with the injunction filing." She looked at him. "You have a man." "I have several men. I have been building toward this case for 2 years, Mrs. Whitlock. I did not expect to crack it with a widow from Iron Pine Forest, but I was not entirely unprepared." He said this without any condescension, just fact. "The problem has always been the center. Without the center, the edges were circumstantial." She sat with that for a moment. "The other families," she said, "the ones Vane documented. I know some of them, or I know where they went." He turned a page. "There are families who lost property to Continental Frontier and didn't disappear. They just moved on, accepted what happened, because fighting wasn't an option they could see." He glanced up briefly. "There'll be options now. As witnesses. As witnesses, as co-claimants, as people who make this bigger than one evicted widow." He said it plainly, but she heard what was underneath it, that one evicted widow on her own was still easier to dismiss, easier to pressure, easier to make disappear than a coalition. Numbers changed the calculation, not just legally, politically. She thought about the families. She thought about Eliza Mercer, who didn't have the option of being a witness anymore. She thought about the locket in her coat pocket, the 2 tiny painted faces. "We use her," she said. "Eliza Mercer. I don't mean instrumentally, I mean we don't let her be anonymous. We make sure her name is in the record." Price stopped writing, looked at her. "Whatever happens in court," she said, "her name should be in it, and the child's name, if Vane recorded it." She paused. "He did. I saw it. The entry where he named the property. He wrote the child's name, Rose." A long silence. "Eliza and Rose Mercer," Price said. He wrote something in the margin of his notebook. "Yes." They were back in Dunmore by the afternoon of the second day following, which was faster than she'd expected and probably cost both their horses something they'd need rest to recover from. Price went directly to his office. She went to the livery, had her horse watered and fed and checked over by the stableman, and then stood in the stable doorway for a moment doing nothing, which was the first nothing she'd allowed herself in what felt like a very long time. Her shoulder ached from where she'd hit the cellar wall going down the stairs. Her hands were chapped, and her lips were cracked, and she was wearing the same 2 outfits she'd been rotating for the better part of 3 weeks. And she was aware, standing in the stable door with the thin autumn light falling across the street and Rook pressed against her knee, that she looked exactly as rough as she felt. She didn't care particularly. She'd stopped caring about that sometime around the second day on the mountain pass, when the wind was bad and the footing was worse, and vanity of any kind became a luxury too expensive to maintain. She went to the boarding house, bathed, changed her shirt, and was back in Price's office within the hour. He'd been busy. The corkboard had been reorganized. New strings, new notes. The vain ledger entries she'd brought him, now integrated into the map he'd been building. He'd sent one of his men, a quiet younger man named Adler, who came and went from the office with the unobtrusive efficiency of someone who'd learned to be useful without being visible, to begin locating the other families documented in Vane's records. And he'd written 4 pages of the injunction filing, which he spread across the desk for her to read. She read slowly and carefully. She'd never read a legal document like this before. Not in the drafting, not while the arguments were still taking their shape, and it was a different experience than she'd expected. It had a structure to it, a logical skeleton that she could follow, and the arguments were not the flowery, self-important language she associated with lawyers and courtrooms. Price wrote precisely. He said what he meant and cited what supported it and moved on. It had this quality of Vane's documentation in a different register, a man who understood that clarity was not weakness. The deed alteration argument, she said, you're building it on the surveyor records and the Foss connection. The Foss connection gives us intent. Without intent, the boundary alterations could theoretically be argued as clerical errors. He sat across from her, jacket off again, pen in his hand. With intent established through Foss's subsequent employment and the payment records, the pattern of fraud becomes legally demonstrable. And the sheriff? The sheriff is our problem, he said, and the flatness in his voice told her it was a problem he'd been sitting with for a while. The county sheriff is a named recipient in the payment records, which means any action that goes through the county, any warrant, any custody situation, any situation that requires local law enforcement, is compromised. If Rusk decides to move against us through official channels before the federal injunction is in place, the sheriff can detain us on whatever pretext he chooses and hold us long enough for things to get very complicated. So we keep out of the county's reach. We do our best. But Dunmore is border county, which means the sheriff has at least nominal jurisdiction here. He paused. I've been careful not to make enemies in this town. Careful doesn't mean safe. She absorbed this. How long for the injunction? The filing goes to Harlan the day after tomorrow. Federal judge, there's a man named Calloway. I've appeared before him twice. He's slow and he's methodical and he does not like being told what to do, but he's honest. I believe he's honest. And these documents are persuasive. He tapped the pile. My estimate is 5 to 7 days from the filing before we have a ruling. 5 to 7 days during which Rusk knows we have what we have. Yes. She looked at the corkboard, at the map of strings and names and dates that Price had been building for 2 years, the center of which had been missing until she'd walked up his stairs with a dead man's ledger tucked inside her coat. He'll come himself, she said. Price looked at her. Rusk, she said. The men at the cabin were employees. When this reaches the level of federal injunction, when he understands what we actually have, he won't send employees. He'll come personally, because personal control is the only control he trusts. She paused. He'll want to make an offer. He'll make an offer that has a threat built into it, Price agreed. That's his pattern. The offer is the polite version of the threat. I want to be there when he makes it. Price studied her. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I want to see his face when he understands that I'm the one who took him apart, she said. And because I want to be certain, when we're done, that he knows it too. The filing went to Harlan on a Tuesday, carried by Adler on a horse that Price clearly trusted more than his own, and the days after it left were the longest and most difficult kind of waiting, the kind where you can't do anything useful, but your mind refuses to be still. She found things to occupy herself with. She went through Price's 2 years of files on Continental Frontier and organized them against the Vane materials, building a master chronology that she wrote out in clean copy for Price to use as reference. She made contact through Adler with 2 of the families he'd identified, a man named Gartner who'd lost grazing land 3 years back, and had moved his family north, and a woman named Hollis, a widow like Mara, whose husband's timber claim had been absorbed by Continental Frontier 4 years ago under circumstances that matched Vane's Code 7, boundary correction, precisely. Gartner was cautious and took 2 days of correspondence to commit to even speaking with Price directly. Hollis agreed the same day Adler reached her, and arrived in Dunmore 2 days later with a box of her own records, receipts, correspondence, the original deed, that she'd been keeping in the back of a trunk for 4 years, waiting, she said, for someone to tell her there was a point to keeping them. She was a small woman, Hollis, narrow-framed, gray at her temples, with hands that showed the same kind of work history as Mara's own, and the specific, compressed look of someone who had been carrying a great deal of weight for a long time and had gotten very efficient at it. They sat in Price's office on the second evening and went through Hollis's records together. "My husband went to the county office to contest the boundary adjustment," Hollis said at some point. She said it the way people said things they had said many times before, in their own heads, rehearsing. The clerk told him the survey was final and there was no appeal process available. When he went back a week later, the clerk was someone different. Nobody seemed to know what had happened to the first one. She paused. "I never found out if anything happened to him. I've wondered." Mara thought about no further contact and said nothing because she wasn't sure what to say that would help rather than hurt. "Your records are useful," she said instead. "The date on your boundary adjustment. It's 2 weeks before the same code appears in Vane's ledger for your property. That's a documentary chain." Hollis looked at her. "You think it'll actually matter? In a court?" "I think," Mara said carefully, "that what we have now is more than any of us had separately. And yes, I think it'll matter." She paused. "I think it has to." Rusk arrived on a Thursday. She heard about it from the woman at the boarding house, who'd heard it from someone who'd seen the private rail car arrive at the Dunmore depot. A car that belonged, everyone apparently knew, to the president of Continental Frontier Holdings, who had properties and interests throughout the territory and traveled through periodically in the manner of a man who owned things and liked to look at them. But he had never come to Dunmore before. Price, when she told him, didn't look surprised. He looked the way he looked when a calculation he'd been running confirmed the answer he'd expected. "How long since the filing?" she asked. 4 days. "He has someone at the federal court." "Almost certainly." He stood up from his desk, walked to the window, looked at the street. "The injunction hasn't been ruled on yet. He has a window, and he knows he has a window, and he'll want to use it before the window closes." He turned back. "He'll contact me first. He'll do it properly, through a letter or a formal meeting request. He's a man who values the appearance of civility." The letter arrived that afternoon. It was written on Continental Frontier Holdings' letterhead, in a hand that was not Rusk's, a secretary's hand, and it was brief and correct and entirely without warmth. Mr. Calder Rusk requested the courtesy of a meeting with Mr. Price at the Grand Imperial Hotel at 10 o'clock the following morning. The letter made no mention of Mara. Price showed it to her. "He doesn't acknowledge me," she said. "He's deciding whether you exist officially. If he doesn't name you, he can claim later that he only sought to discuss ongoing business matters with your attorney." He set the letter down. "He'll know you exist. He won't want it on paper." "I'll be there," she said. "I was going to suggest it." The Grand Imperial Hotel was the most imposing building in Dunmore. 4 stories, brick, with a dining room on the ground floor that served people who could afford to eat in rooms with tablecloths. Mara had walked past it twice in her time in town without considering going in. She walked through the front door at 9:55 in the morning wearing her best coat, which was clean but showed its years, with the rifle slung over her back because she was not walking into any building without it. And she held the door for an older man coming out who looked at her. The size of her, the rifle, the shepherd dog who was not technically supposed to be inside but who had followed her through the door before she could tell him to stay. And then looked at Price, who was beside her, and simply stepped to the side and let them all pass. Rusk was already in the dining room. She recognized him from nothing specific. She'd never seen a likeness of him, never met him. But she would have known him in any room because he was the kind of man who arranged himself in spaces as if he'd paid for them, which in this case he probably had. He was older than she'd pictured, late 50s, silver-haired, well-dressed without being ostentatious, with a face that was still handsome in the architectural way of men who had always expected to be looked at. He had a coffee cup in front of him and two men at a table 10 feet away who were not eating and were watching the room. He looked at Price when they came in. Then he looked at Mara. Something moved through his face, quick, controlled, the micro-expression of a man recalibrating very fast. He stood, which surprised her slightly. He gestured to the chairs across from him. "Mr. Price," he said. "Mrs. Whitlock." So he did know her name. They sat. She put the rifle across her knees and Rook settled beside her chair, and Rusk looked at both of them with the same controlled expression he'd used on everything so far. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding we can resolve without requiring the courts to become involved." "There's no misunderstanding," Price said. Rusk's mouth moved into something that was built from a smile but wasn't quite one. "A former employee kept personal records that may reflect, inaccurately, on certain business practices. I understand these records have come into your possession. I'm prepared to be generous in reaching a resolution." "How generous?" Price asked. His voice was completely neutral. Rusk named a number. It was aimed at Mara. She understood that immediately, the way the offer was shaped, the way his eyes moved to her as he spoke it. It was enough money to make the problem of her homeless, evicted life disappear. Enough to rebuild, enough to leave the territory, if she chose, and start something new somewhere no one knew her name or her husband's name or anything about any of this. She said nothing. "That offer," Price said, "is contingent on what exactly?" "The return of any materials removed from private property in Iron Pine Forest, and a withdrawal of any filings made under false pretenses." Rusk took a sip of his coffee. "This can all be very quiet. No one needs to be embarrassed." Mara reached into her coat pocket. She set Eliza Mercer's locket on the table between them. It was tarnished and small, and it sat on the white tablecloth, and it was the least impressive object in the room by every material measure, and she watched Calder Rusk look at it. He looked at it for longer than he should have. His hand, which had been resting relaxed on the table, became still in a way that was different from its previous relaxation. The stillness of control rather than ease. "Silas Vane kept that," she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that. He couldn't bear that someone had just vanished as if they'd never been, so he kept something that proved she had been. She paused. "Her name was Eliza Mercer. Her daughter's name was Rose. Your company's ledger lists their property as acquired under Code 3. She let that sit. "I know what Code 3 means, Mr. Rusk." The dining room was not loud to begin with, but the quality of the silence at their table was different from the general ambient quiet. It had weight. Rusk looked at her. His expression had not broken. She'd give him that. He was very good at this. But there was something behind his eyes now that had not been there at the beginning of the meeting. Not fear, not quite. Something adjacent to it. The recognition of someone who had just discovered that the terrain they were standing on was not what they'd mapped. "I don't know what you believe he started. "I know what's in the vault," she said. "I know what's in 4 years of your corporate ledgers. I know what's in Silas Vane's personal record of every order he received and every alteration he made and every name of every official who accepted payment to look the other way." She kept her voice steady and her hands flat on the table. "I know that the mineral rights clause in my deed was inserted fraudulently, and I know who ordered it inserted, and I know why. And in approximately 3 to 4 days, a federal judge in Harlan is going to know all of those things as well." Rusk was silent. "Your offer," Price said pleasantly, "has been noted and declined." Something happened in Rusk's face then. Not a break, exactly. More like a shift. The way weather shifted when a front was moving through. The pressure changing before anything visible happened. He looked at Mara for a long moment. Then he looked at the locket. Then he picked up his coffee cup, drank from it, and set it down precisely in its saucer. "I see," he said. Very quiet. He stood. His two men were already on their feet. "This will not end the way you're expecting," he said. He wasn't threatening, exactly. Or he was, but with the particular quality of a man who was stating something he believed to be simply true. He said it to both of them, but he looked at Mara when he said it. She looked back. "Mr. Rusk," she said. "It already has." He left. She sat at the table until his footsteps were gone, and the two men with him were gone, and the dining room had returned to its ordinary sounds. And then she let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for the entire meeting. Price watched her. Then he picked up the locket and handed it back to her. "You knew he'd recognize it," he said. "That's why you brought it." "I thought he might." She tucked it back into her pocket. "He recognized it." "Yes," Price said. "He did." That night, Rusk's men rode for Iron Pine Forest. She didn't know it while it was happening. She learned it 2 days later, from Adler, who'd had someone watching the stable where Rusk's men kept their horses. 4 of them saddled and out the back of the stable before midnight, heading east, the direction of Iron Pine. But Price had not been idle in the days since the filing. His man had already been to the cabin. The vault was empty. The corporate ledgers, all 4 of them, the rolled survey map, every document that had been sitting in that iron box in the cellar for 4 years, were no longer in Iron Pine Forest. They were in a locked box in a law office in Harlan, delivered into the hands of federal marshals, along with a notarized statement from Price and a sworn affidavit from Mara Whitlock, describing exactly where she had found them and exactly what they contained. When Rusk's men broke into the cabin and pried up the flagstone and forced the vault, they did force it. The dial mechanism was damaged in the way of a vault that had been opened by someone who didn't have the combination. They found nothing. An empty iron box. She imagined one of them standing down there in that cellar with a lantern, looking at the open vault, understanding what that emptiness meant. She found she felt something about that. Not satisfaction exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. The feeling of a door that had been locked for a very long time finally opening in the right direction. 4 days after the meeting at the Grand Imperial, the federal ruling came back. She was in Price's office when Adler brought the telegram. She watched Price read it, watched his face do something that was not his usual controlled expression, something that had been pressed down for a long time and was releasing, carefully, the way pressure released from a vessel when the seal finally gave. He set the telegram on the desk and looked at her. "Injunction granted," he said. The words were small and plain, and they hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way that made her want to sit down, which she did. Development across all disputed properties was frozen pending full judicial review. The Territorial Sheriff's Office had been flagged for federal oversight pending investigation of the payment records. And the part that made Price's careful face do that thing again. 3 federal marshals had been dispatched to Dunmore to take Calder Rusk into custody for questioning. They arrived the following morning. She was not at the Grand Imperial when it happened. She found out about it afterward, in pieces. From different people who had been in different parts of the dining room or the lobby or the street outside. The marshals entered. They were formal and correct, the way federal marshals were when they were doing something that was going to be discussed for a long time afterward. Rusk was at breakfast, actually eating apparently eggs and coffee at the same table where he'd sat across from Mara 2 days earlier with 2 of his men flanking him. The marshals spoke to him. He stood. And then Calder Rusk, the president of Continental Frontier Holdings, the man who had nailed an eviction notice to her door before dawn and stolen her land and documented the erasure of people's lives in columns of coded ledger numbers, was walked out of the dining room of the Grand Imperial Hotel in front of everyone who had been there to see it. The room, by every account, went completely silent. She heard about it that afternoon, sitting in Price's office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because she'd been too occupied with the telegram transcripts and the follow-up correspondence to remember to drink it. And when Adler finished describing it, she held the cold coffee cup in both hands and stared at the corkboard on the wall and felt something move through her that she couldn't name and didn't try to. Price was watching her. "It's not over," he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "I know," she said. "The trial will take months. His lawyers will file every motion available to them. There will be days when it looks like it might collapse." He paused. "The injunction holds. The evidence is in federal hands. But between now and a conviction, if there is a conviction, there will be a great deal of difficulty." "I know," she said again. "Are you all right?" She thought about that seriously, because he'd asked it seriously. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've been so focused on getting to this point that I haven't thought much about what it would feel like to be here." She looked at the cold coffee. "It doesn't feel the way I expected." "How did you expect it to feel?" She considered. "Finished. I expected it to feel finished," she paused. "It doesn't feel finished. It feels like the first thing that's gone right in a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's an accurate assessment of where we are." She looked at the corkboard again. The strings. The names. The clippings and records and notations that represented 2 years of work on his part, 4 years of hidden records on Vane's part, 11 years of a man whose name was in the ledger under no further contact who had not been able to keep his property or his life, and a child named Rose, who was a painted portrait in a silver locket in Mara Whitlock's coat pocket. "We need to find the Mercer family," she said. "Whatever's left of them, relatives, anyone." Price looked at her. "I've already asked Adler to start looking." She nodded. Drank her cold coffee. Outside, Dunmore was going about its afternoon, which was something ordinary towns did regardless of what had just shifted beneath them. She could hear the street sounds through the window. Horses, voices, the particular creak of a wagon on the boards outside the general store. Normal sounds. Everyday sounds. She was still here, in the middle of them, and the man who had nailed that notice to her door was in federal custody, and the ledgers that documented what he'd done were in Harlan with the kind of people who had the power to do something about them. It was not finished, but it was different than it had been. She finished the coffee, set the cup down, and picked up the next page of the correspondence that needed her attention. There was still a great deal of work to do, and she had never in her life been a woman who sat still while there was work in front of her. The trial was set for spring. That meant 4 months of waiting, which turned out to be 4 months of work so dense and relentless that the waiting never quite felt like waiting. There were depositions to prepare, witnesses to locate and interview, documentary chains to build and rebuild until they were airtight enough that a corporate lawyer running at them with everything he had would find nothing to grab onto. Price worked the way Mara had learned to work in the first winter after Daniel died, methodically, without drama, with the specific focus of someone who understood that the only alternative to forward motion was standing still, and standing still was not something either of them was built for. Continental Frontier Holdings did not collapse quietly. She hadn't expected it to. Rusk had lawyers, plural, expensive, the kind who arrived from the eastern cities in good coats and set up in the best hotel in Harlan and immediately began filing motions. There were challenges to the provenance of the Vane documents. There were arguments about the chain of custody of the corporate ledgers, about whether evidence found in an abandoned property by a private citizen constituted admissible discovery, about the validity of the federal court's jurisdiction over what Rusk's lead attorney kept calling a straightforward land dispute that had been inflated beyond recognition by parties with grievances and agendas. Price countered every motion. He was not a flashy lawyer. She'd understood that within the first day of working with him. He didn't perform the way some lawyers performed, didn't fill a room with his voice, or use theatrics to make simple things seem profound. He was methodical and precise, and when he spoke it was because he had something specific to say, and he said it clearly and stopped. She had watched him in the federal court offices in Harlan on the days she'd accompanied him for hearings, and she had watched the judge, Calloway, the slow, methodical, honest man Price had described. Watching Price, and she had understood something about how Price worked. He was building the judge's trust the way you built anything worth having, which was slowly and with sound materials. The motion to suppress the Vane documents was denied. The jurisdictional challenge was denied. Continental Frontier's lead attorney, a man named Grohl, who had a face like he'd been told all his life he was the smartest person in any room he entered and had not yet encountered evidence to the contrary, began the trial in March with a confident opening statement that characterized the case as a vindictive attempt by a grieving widow and a failed attorney to manufacture a conspiracy out of the private papers of a mentally unstable former employee. He said failed attorney with a particular emphasis, looking at Price when he said it, and Mara, sitting in the gallery, watched Price's face during this and saw precisely nothing change in it. Not anger, not embarrassment, not the flicker of ego that the word failed was designed to ignite. Just attention. He was listening to Grohl the way you listen to something you were going to take apart later, carefully cataloging which pieces would be useful. She appreciated that about him more than she could easily put into words. She testified on the 4th day. She had prepared for it. Price had prepared her for it, in the specific way that preparation for something frightening worked, which was not that the preparation removed the fear, but that it gave the fear somewhere useful to go. She knew what she would be asked, and she knew what she needed to say, and she knew that Grohl would try to undermine her credibility through a series of techniques she'd been warned about, emphasizing her inexperience, her grief, her physical appearance, her isolation. He would try to make her seem like someone who had stumbled into something she didn't understand and had drawn conclusions that a more rational, more educated, more objective observer would not have drawn. She sat in the witness chair, and she was aware of the room in the way you were aware of things when they mattered. The weight of the gallery behind her, the specific quality of the light through the courthouse windows, the scratch of the court reporter's pen. She was aware of her own size in the chair, the way she always was in formal spaces not designed with her in mind. And she made a decision early in the testimony, before Grohl had gotten through his second question, to simply stop being aware of it. The awareness served nothing and cost her focus she needed for better uses. Price asked her questions first. He walked her through the events in the order they'd happened, and she answered clearly and without embellishment, because he'd told her that embellishment was what juries remembered when a witness turned out to be wrong about something. Just what she had done, and what she had found, and what she had understood from what she found. The ledger, the vault, the entries, the survey map, the two riders in the hollow, the night ride out, Rusk at the Grand Imperial, the locket. She took the locket out of her pocket when Price asked her to and held it up so the court could see it, and then she described what was inside it and what Vane had written about it and what the corporate ledger listed as the acquisition method for the Mercer property. She did this without crying, which she was grateful for, not because there was anything wrong with crying in a courthouse, but because she'd wanted to be heard, and sometimes when you cried people heard the crying instead of the words. Then Grohl stood up. He spent 40 minutes trying to find something that would move her, and she sat in the chair and answered his questions and did not give him what he was looking for. He tried the inexperience angle. She described the cross-referencing methodology she'd used against Daniel's survey maps in enough precise detail that he abandoned that line. He tried the emotional instability angle, the grief, the isolation, the circumstances of finding the ledger. She acknowledged that she was grieving, that she was alone, that the circumstances were unusual, and then she said, "The contents of the documents did not change based on my emotional state at the time of finding them. The entries are what they are regardless of who read them." He tried to argue that she couldn't have read and accurately interpreted legal and financial documents without training. She pointed out that she had managed the bookkeeping and contracts for a 640-acre ranch for 11 years, and that she had cross-referenced the vault documents against both Vane's personal ledger and 3 external survey sources before drawing any conclusions. On the question of her physical condition and capability during the events she'd described, the ride to Dunmore, the return to the cabin, the flight through the forest, he spent several minutes in a line of questioning whose direction was clear enough that 2 people in the gallery shifted audibly in their seats, and Judge Calloway gave Grohl a look that Mara had seen on the faces of people who were deciding how much patience they had left for a particular approach. She answered those questions the same way she'd answered the others. What she had done, how she had done it, what the outcome had been. "And you're asking this court," Grohl said in his summing up tone, "to accept that a woman alone, with no legal training, no survey expertise, and no previous experience with corporate documentation, correctly identified, interpreted, and preserved evidence sufficient to support federal fraud charges against one of the most significant land development companies in this territory. I'm not asking the court to accept anything based on my qualities," she said. "I'm asking the court to accept the documents, which speak for themselves. I was the person who found them. What I am has nothing to do with what they contain." Grohl looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down. The other witnesses came after her over the following days, and each one added something to the structure that Price had been building. Gartner testified about his boundary dispute and the clerical correction he'd been told had moved his eastern fence line 40 rods, and the subsequent loss of the water access that had made the property viable. He was a careful man on the stand, measured, not given to anger in public. She could tell the anger was there, underneath, compressed into something that had been under pressure for 3 years, and the compression made him more credible rather than less. Juries, Price had told her, were sometimes suspicious of people who seemed to want too badly to win. Hollis testified about her husband's visits to the county clerk and the disappearing clerk and the final disposition of the timber claim, and she produced her box of records, and they were entered into evidence one document at a time, and Grohl's objections to each one were overruled with the particular patience of a judge who had been overruling the same attorney's objections for several days and had developed a specific professional rhythm for doing so. And then Price called his last witness, a former Continental Frontier Holdings surveyor named Bet, who had worked under Vane and who had, it turned out, kept his own records for his own reasons. Not as comprehensive as Vane's, not as systematically organized, but corroborating on the specific question of the boundary alteration orders and the instruction that the adjustments were never to appear in official survey submissions. Bet was not a heroic witness. I was a nervous man who had been quietly carrying something for 7 years, and who had, in Price's characterization of him when he'd told Mara about finding him, more relief than courage. He answered questions in a low voice that the court reporter had to ask him twice to repeat, and he kept his eyes on the floor more than on the room, and under Grohl's cross-examination he became visibly uncertain enough that she held her breath for 20 minutes. But on the core facts, the orders, the adjustments, the instruction about official submissions, he held. Because those were things he remembered clearly, the way people remembered clearly the specific moments when they'd understood that they were doing something wrong and had done it anyway, because those moments tended to stay with you in exact detail long after the ordinary memories had blurred. Price's closing argument lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes. She sat in the gallery and listened to every word, and she thought, not for the first time, that Clement in Millhaven had been more right than he'd known when he'd described Price as the only man in 3 territories who even attempted this. Because what Price did in that hour and 20 minutes was not advocacy in the rhetorical sense. He didn't build to emotional peaks or deploy the polished sentences of someone who'd rehearsed for effect. He laid out the evidence the way you laid out the pieces of something you'd taken apart to show someone else how it worked. He connected each piece to the next with a patience that was not boring because it was building towards something, and by the time he reached the end, the structure he'd built was visible to the room in a way that it hadn't been before he started. He named Eliza Mercer near the end. He named her and he named Rose, and he described Silas Vane's last ledger entry and what it said about keeping the locket. And he said, "The question before this court is not only about land and money and corporate fraud, significant as all of those things are. The question is about whether the law in this territory means anything to the people it is supposed to protect. Eliza and Rose Mercer cannot be in this room. Silas Vane cannot be in this room. Daniel Whitlock cannot be in this room. But the record of what was done to them is here, and it is thorough, and it is specific, and it was preserved by a man who was not brave enough to do more, but was decent enough to make sure someone could. This court has the opportunity to be what Silas Vane could not be. I would ask you to take it." He sat down. The room was quiet. Judge Calloway looked at the jury and told them they were dismissed to deliberate, and they filed out, and Mara sat in the gallery and did not move for several minutes. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Not long. Price told her that for a case of this complexity, a day and a half was fast. It meant there hadn't been significant disagreement, just thorough process. She spent the day and a half in Price's temporary office in Harlan doing the kind of work that existed in inverse proportion to how much she could actually concentrate on it. And Rook spent the time under the desk with his chin on her feet, which was his method of communicating that he was available if she needed grounding and expected nothing from her in return. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on 7 counts, including the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, the count of bribery of public officials, and the 3 counts connected to what the indictment carefully described as unlawful coercion and deprivation resulting in the deaths of named persons. The deaths count had been the hardest count to build. Vane's no further contact entries were not confessions, and proving criminal responsibility without direct witness testimony was the kind of legal challenge that had kept Price up at more than one night. But the corroborating pattern across 4 properties and Bet's testimony about the specific directives he'd received had been enough. She heard the verdict read in the courtroom and she sat with it. Not triumph. She'd expected triumph, and she got something more complicated than that. Something that was partly relief and partly grief, and partly the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and had just been permitted to set it down. She was aware of Price beside her, and she was aware of Hollis, 2 seats over, who made a sound that was not quite a sob and was not quite a breath, but was somewhere between both. And she was aware of the room and the light and the weight in her own chest that was releasing, slowly, the way things released that had been compressed for a long time. Rusk was led from the room. He passed her table. He didn't look at her, which told her more about him in that moment than anything he'd said or done in all the months preceding. He could look at federal marshals. He could look at a judge. He couldn't look at her. She understood what that meant, and she let it stand without making anything more of it. He had built an empire on the premise that some people didn't matter enough to fight back. He had been wrong about that. The aftermath was slower than the trial itself, and in some ways harder to navigate, because it involved a great many practical decisions being made about things that had stopped being theoretical. Continental Frontier Holdings, without Rusk at its head, and with its financial records now subject to full federal audit, began the process of dissolution that large corrupt enterprises undergo when the structure holding them together is removed. Not a collapse exactly, more like a subsidence, the way a building settles when its foundation is compromised, a slow and grinding process that left debris in every direction. Investors began withdrawing. The board of directors, several of whom had known nothing specific about Rusk's methods, and several of whom had known quite a lot, issued a statement that Price read to her with the particular expression of a man who had seen this kind of statement before and was not impressed by it. Asset freezes were put in place. The federal audit identified, over the following months, a scale of fraudulent property acquisition that was larger than even Vane's records had fully documented. Dozens of properties across 3 territories, many of whose former owners had long since moved away, or given up, or died. The families who could be found were found, slowly, through the work of Adler and several other people Price enlisted over the spring and summer. Not all of them. Some had moved so far and so finally that the finding would have taken years and resources that didn't exist. But enough of them were found that the restitution process had real weight, real people with real names and real records of what they'd lost, standing in the documentation rather than only being spaces where people used to be. For her own property, the legal process took 4 months after the verdict. The mineral rights clause was ruled invalid, fraudulently inserted, as she'd told Price in his office the first morning, as Vane's records confirmed and Betts' testimony supported. The original deed was restored, and then the federal surveyors went on to her 640 acres and confirmed what the assay report in Vane's vault had described. A silver-bearing quartz formation beneath the western portion of the property, running deeper and wider than the preliminary estimate had indicated. The settlement figure, when the full accounting was done, was $200,000. She sat in Price's Dunmore office. They were back in Dunmore by then, the Harlan chapter finished. When he told her the final number, and she looked at it on paper for a moment, and then she looked at him, and he was watching her with the expression of a man who was curious about her reaction and trying not to show that he was curious about it. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "That's the right response," he said. "Most people would know exactly what to do with it." "Most people haven't done what you did to arrive at it," he said. "It changes the character of the money." She sat with that. It was true, she thought, and it was also true that she was a woman who had been raised to believe that money was what you worked for and counted and spent on necessary things and saved where possible, and that the version of money she was looking at on paper had a different quality than anything she'd ever worked with before. It was large enough to change anything. It was large enough to become its own kind of trap, if she let it. She thought about what she wanted. She thought about Daniel, who had built something real and deserved to have had it be permanent. She thought about Vane, who had documented everything and done nothing, and had spent the last years of his life in a cabin in the forest with his conscience, and had written, at the end, "Do more than I did." She thought about Hollis, who had kept her box of records in the back of a trunk for 4 years, and arrived in Dunmore with them without hesitation when Adler reached her. She thought about Gartner and his compressed anger. She thought about the families Adler had found and the families he hadn't been able to find, and the families they would never find because they'd been in the ledger, under no further contact, and were gone. She thought about herself 6 months ago. No, 7 now, nearly 8, standing in a cold street in Millhaven after Clement had named a number she didn't have, understanding that she was going to have to find a different way through because the official path was closed to her. "I want to set something up," she said. "A fund. Legal assistance. Real legal assistance. Not the kind that costs $75 just to sit down. For ranchers and homesteaders, and anyone who can't afford to fight what's being done to them." She paused. "Something permanent. Something that would still be running after we're both gone." Price was quiet for a moment. "It should be named for you," she said. "You and this case." He shook his head. "The case should be named for what it was." He thought for a moment. "Call it the Frontierland Defense Fund. What it does is its name. Price Frontier Land Defense Fund, she said. Both things. He looked like he was going to argue, and then he looked like he'd decided not to, which she recognized as a specific kind of concession from a man who didn't make concessions easily. The fund needs a board, he said. People who understand both the legal and the practical sides. Hollis, she said immediately. Hollis, he agreed. Gartner. And I know a federal land assessor who's been fighting for reform from inside the bureaucracy for years and hasn't gotten anywhere because the bureaucracy is very good at absorbing individual effort. Good, she said. We'll need people who know how the system works and are angry about it. He almost smiled. That's most of the useful people in any field. The Mercer family took 6 months to find. Adler found them eventually, a sister of Eliza's who had moved away before the events at the homestead and had spent years not knowing with certainty what had happened to her sister and the child, living with the particular grief of people who disappear without explanation. Her name was Clara, and she lived 2 territories north, and when Adler's letter reached her, she wrote back within a week. Mara wrote to her directly after that. Not about the case, all the legal dimensions of it were handled through Price, but the other thing, the personal thing, the thing that existed alongside the legal machinery and couldn't be resolved by it. She wrote about the locket, what Vane had written, that he had kept it because he couldn't bear for Eliza to have simply vanished as if she'd never been, that the name Eliza Mercer was now in the federal court record, that Rose was named there too, that whatever had happened to them had happened, and no amount of legal resolution undid that, but the record existed and would persist, and they had not been erased the way the men who took from them had intended. Clara's reply came 3 weeks later. It was not long. It said, in part, that she had not known if anyone would ever find out what had happened, and that knowing someone had, and that her sister's name was in the record, was the first time in 4 years that she had been able to sleep through a full night. Mara kept that letter in the same pocket where she'd kept the locket for a while. Then she put it in the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, next to the documents that mattered, next to Daniel's coffee mug. She went back to the cabin the following autumn, not to retrieve anything or to resolve anything. All of that was done. She went because she needed to close the circle of it in some way that wasn't legal or financial or procedural, some private accounting that she owed herself. The trail into Iron Pine was the same trail. The forest was the same forest, which she'd known intellectually, but which still surprised her slightly when she rode into it and felt the quality of the quiet settle around her. That particular forest quiet that wasn't absence of sound, but presence of a different kind of sound, wind and leaves, and the distant knock of a woodpecker and nothing else. Rook ran ahead of her. He was older by a year, which wasn't visible to anyone who didn't know him, but was visible to her in the slight grain at his muzzle, and the way he sometimes chose the path of slightly less resistance, rather than scrambling over every obstacle just because it was there. She watched him run ahead and thought, not for the first time, that she owed him something she didn't have the right words for. He had scratched at the fireplace floor on the first night. That was, when you traced the whole thing back, where it had started. The cabin was not the same. She'd had work done on it over the spring. The roof repaired properly this time, new windows, a wide porch built on the south side where the afternoon light fell long and warm. She had not intended to make it beautiful when she'd arranged for the work, but the man she'd hired had built things with more care than she'd specified, and somewhere between the sill height and the porch railing he'd made something that was more than functional. She tied her horse and stood in front of it for a moment. It was still small, still hidden in its hollow, still backed against the hillside that blocked the northwest wind. Still 20 miles from the nearest town on a trail that got bad in the rain. The forest pressed in close on 3 sides and the light was filtered and gray even on a good day. She loved it in a way she hadn't expected to love anything so recently after loving everything she'd had to leave behind. She climbed the porch steps, all of them, solid now, no missing one, and sat in the chair she'd had placed there, and Rook came and lay across her feet, and she sat for a long time in the quiet and the dappled light and let the silence be what it was. She thought about Daniel, as she often did. Not with the wrenching quality of early grief, but with the different quality of grief that had been lived with long enough to become integrated. Not gone, not smaller exactly, but changed in texture. She thought about the ranch, the 11 years of it, what they'd built, and what had been taken, and what had turned out to be underneath the soil they'd worked. She thought that he would have been furious, and that the fury would have been righteous and useful, and that he would have liked Price, the directness of him, the way he said what he meant and meant what he said. She thought that he would have been proud of her, and she sat with that thought carefully, because it was one she hadn't let herself have very often. And it was large and complicated, and it didn't resolve into anything simple when she held it. Then she stopped thinking and just sat. The fund had its first 3 cases running. Hollis was managing the intake process with an efficiency that had surprised no one who'd met her. Gartner's land had been restored through the restitution process, and he'd gone back to ranching, and she'd received a letter from him 3 weeks ago that was brief and not given to sentiment. He was not a sentimental man, the letter made that clear. But that ended with, "What you did mattered. I wanted you to know I understand that." Clara Mercer had come to Dunmore in the spring to receive her sister's locket and to see the court record with Eliza and Rose's names in it. Mara had been there. They had not talked much. There wasn't much to say that the locket and the record didn't already say, but Clara had held the locket for a long time and then tucked it inside her coat very carefully and nodded, and that had been enough. The county sheriff had been removed from office pending federal investigation. The replacement had no connection to Continental Frontier Holdings because Continental Frontier Holdings no longer existed in any meaningful form, and this seemed to Mara like a small and specific justice that was easy to overlook amid the larger ones, but that she noticed and was glad of. Price was still working. He was always working. He'd taken on 3 new corporate fraud cases in the months since the verdict, because apparently word traveled in the particular community of people who had been wronged by powerful entities and had not been able to find anyone willing to take their side. She suspected he would be working until he couldn't, which, given his constitution, might be a very long time. She told him once, in a moment that she wasn't sure either of them had expected, that she thought he was the best version of what a lawyer was supposed to be, which was not a compliment she gave easily. And he'd looked at her with the undefended expression he sometimes had when something caught him off guard and said, "You're the reason any of it worked. I want you to know I understand that." Which was more or less what she'd said to him in different words. And they'd both recognized the echo, and neither of them had needed to do anything with it. She sat on the porch as the afternoon moved and the light changed, and the forest did the things forests did when there was no one specifically asking them to perform. She was not who she'd been when she'd first ridden down this trail. That woman had had $45 and a broken-roofed cabin and grief so large it sometimes felt like weather, something you existed inside of rather than something you carried. She had still been herself, underneath all of that. But the self had been pressed flat by circumstances, and she hadn't yet had reason to discover how far it could expand back. She knew now. Not because of the money, which was real and mattered, and had made possible things that would not otherwise have been possible, but because of what she'd done to arrive at it. The cross-referencing in the cellar by lamplight, the 7-day ride to Dunmore, the meeting at the Grand Imperial where she'd set a locket on a tablecloth and watched a powerful man understand that he was finished, the witness stand, Grohl's questions, the choice to answer each one clearly and stop and wait for the next. She had been told, implicitly and explicitly, in 100 ways large and small over the course of her life, and specifically over the course of the past year, that she was the wrong kind of person to do the things she'd done. Too heavy, too inexperienced, too alone, too recently bereaved, too much of everything that didn't count and not enough of anything that did. The frontier, people had told her, would crush her. She looked at the forest, at the repaired cabin, at Rook sleeping across her feet in a patch of afternoon sun. The frontier had not crushed her. It had given her a dead man's ledger and a hidden vault and a question, "What are you going to do with this?" And she had answered the question the only way she knew how to answer any question, which was by figuring out what needed to be done and then doing it, imperfectly and ungracefully and without anyone's permission or approval, one step at a time, across mountain passes and through dark forests and into courtrooms and out the other side. She had not needed to be different to do it, thinner or tougher looking or more palatable to the people who'd looked at her and drawn their conclusions before she'd opened her mouth. She had needed to be exactly what she was, which was stubborn and capable, and unwilling to accept that the people who'd decided she didn't matter had the authority to make that determination. They didn't. Nobody had that authority over another person. That, she thought, was perhaps the thing she most wanted the fund to carry forward. Not just the legal assistance, though that mattered enormously and practically, but the premise underneath it. That the question of who deserves to fight for what they've built does not get answered by the people doing the taking. The sun moved. The forest shifted around her in the small, continuous way. Forest shifted. Nothing that would make a good story, just the slow, ordinary movement of living things going about their business. Rook made a sound in his sleep. Some dog dream, something he was chasing or being chased by. She put her hand on his flank and felt the steady movement of his breathing under her palm. "Easy," she said. "You're all right." He settled. She stayed on the porch until the light started to go gold, which was the particular quality of late afternoon light in autumn that she'd always found difficult to explain and easy to recognize. Then she stood, and her knees registered the day's sitting with their usual complaint, and she stretched, and she went inside to start a fire. The cabin smelled like wood and the pine resin that came through the new windows, and something underneath both of those things that she now recognized as simply the smell of the place itself. The underground cold of the cellar, the old brick, the history of it. Silas Vane had sat in this room for years, carrying what he knew and unable to act on it, and she had sat in this room for a handful of days and acted on it. She didn't think worse of Vane for the difference. She thought he had been a frightened man with a conscience that kept better records than his courage could support, and in the end the records had been enough. And that was not a small thing. She built the fire carefully, the way she'd been taught, the way she'd taught herself, starting small and building. It caught. She sat with it for a while, just watching it find itself, and then she got up and made her supper and fed Rook and went to the window and looked at the dark forest for a moment before she closed the shutter. Everything she could see was hers. Not the way it had been hers and Daniel's, which was the particular ownership of people who had built something together and knew every inch of it from the inside. A different kind of ownership, harder to explain, less comfortable in some ways, and entirely her own. She pulled the shutter and went back to the fire. Rook came and lay beside her chair, and the fire made its sounds, and outside the forest was dark and quiet and full of its own life. And Mara Whitlock sat in the cabin she'd bought for $45 and closed her eyes. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she felt something that was not bracing for the next thing. She felt still. Not finished. She was not a woman who was ever fully finished, and she knew that about herself clearly enough not to pretend otherwise. The fund had cases. Price had cases. The world had an abundance of powerful people who believed that their power was self-justifying, and an abundance of ordinary people who were going to need someone willing to disagree with that premise. And she intended to be one of those people for as long as she was able. But right now, tonight, in this room, with the fire and the dog and the dark forest around her, she was still. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.